Welcome to the show. And please tell me where you're watching this video. Leave your reply in the comments below. The world did not change with a gunshot or a speech. It changed with a stamp, a single policy line. Signed in Washington on the 16th of December, 2025. Took effect on the 1st of January, 2026. And suddenly, the map of movement hardened like wet cement. Names were grouped. Passports were judged. Whole peoples were treated not as individuals, but as categories of risk. Then, almost immediately, something rare happened. Mali and Burkina Faso answered with reciprocity. Quiet, administrative, unromantic. No theatrical outrage. No pleading for exemptions. Just a mirror held up to the most powerful travel document on Earth, forcing a question that borders are designed to hide. When one side can refuse the other without explanation, is that security or hierarchy? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. Subscribe now and keep watching to the end. Because this story is not really about airports. It is about dignity. It is about who gets to walk the global road as if it belongs to them, and who is stopped at the gate again and again until hope turns to indifference. And once indifference spreads, power loses its gravity. So what kind of system makes exclusion feel normal until it is reflected back? It began the way modern power often begins, not with a drumbeat, but with paperwork. On the 16th of December, 2025, the United States issued a presidential proclamation to restrict and limit the entry of foreign nationals, framing the move in the language of national security and public safety. The policy was scheduled to take effect on the 1st of January, 2026. To many viewers, that sounds familiar. Another iteration of a border hardening, another list of countries, another season of headlines. But the details matter, because details are where hierarchies hide. According to a Congressional Research Service summary, the proclamation broadened restrictions to nationals of 39 countries, plus individuals traveling on Palestinian Authority-issued travel documents. It also built on an earlier proclamation from the 4th of June, 2025. This was not a single lock on a single door. It was a system of doors, arranged in tiers. And within that tiered structure, some states were placed under the harshest category, what observers described as a total suspension of entry or visa issuance. In the days that followed, reporting and legal summaries repeatedly highlighted a specific set of countries associated with the most sweeping restrictions: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Laos, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, and Syria. This is where the story shifts from policy to psychology. A border policy is never only a border policy. It is a message, written in administrative ink, about who is presumed harmless and who is presumed suspect. It decides who gets to move along the global road as if it were a right, and who must approach that road as if it were a courtroom. Documents in hand, explanations prepared, dignity folded neatly into a plastic folder. When a proclamation like this lands, it does more than restrict travel. It teaches the world, once again, that the passport is not just a document. It is a ranking, a code, a quiet sorting mechanism. And then almost immediately, two governments responded in a way that made the ranking visible. A legal monitor summary from the Law Library of Congress notes that Burkina Faso issued a communiqué on the 30th of December 2025, and Mali issued a communiqué on the 2nd of January 2026. Both referenced the principle of reciprocity in adopting measures directed at United States citizens, an answer framed not as theater, but as symmetry. This is the part many audiences did not expect, because it was not delivered with the usual diplomatic music. No grand summit, no months of negotiation, no ornate language about friendship and shared values. just a plain signal. If you apply a rule to us, we will apply an equivalent rule to you. News reports described the announcement as retaliatory or tit for tat, an explicit response to Washington's new restrictions rooted in reciprocity. And crucially, it was presented as an action of principle rather than a plea for mercy. Why did that matter? If the practical impact was likely small, because power is not only measured in trade flows and tourist numbers, it is measured in assumptions. The United States passport carries an invisible expectation that borders will open, that visas are formalities, that the world is arranged to accommodate its holder. Most of the time, that expectation is never tested, so it feels like nature. Reciprocity tests it. Reciprocity drags the invisible into daylight. Think of the global mobility system as a field soil packed down by decades of habit. For generations, some travelers walked over it like it was solid ground, while others sank at every step, stuck in a mud of interviews, rejections, fees, and humiliation. The ground felt natural only because the weight was unevenly distributed. But when Burkina Faso and Mali invoked reciprocity, they did something deceptively simple. They pressed their own footprint into the same soil. They did not claim the field was fair. They demonstrated that the field was designed, and design can be copied. That is why this moment carried more force than its immediate logistics. It was a mirror held up to the architecture of movement itself. Not a debate about one traveler or one incident, but a question about the entire structure. Who gets to define risk, and whose identity is treated as risk by default? The proclamation of the 16th of December, 2025, was presented as protection, protecting the United States from threats. Yet the very breadth of the categories and the way whole nations could be moved between tiers revealed what border policy always reveals when you look closely. The line between security and status is thin, and it is often drawn far away from the people who must live under it. Burkina Faso and Mali did not invent that line. They traced it back in reverse, forcing it to be seen. And once seen, it becomes harder to ignore, because the true shock is not that a border can be closed. The true shock is the realization that it can be closed without you doing anything at all. So here is the hinge point we have reached. If a single administrative action can turn nationality into suspicion, and if reciprocity can flip the script without firing a shot, what happens when millions of people stop treating the mobility hierarchy as destiny and start treating it as a tool? Because the moment a hierarchy becomes a tool, it stops being a law of nature. And that is when the ground beneath the system begins to shift. The question now is not whether these bans will last, it is what else will be mirrored next. Once the world realizes the gate was never sacred in the first place, what made this story combust was not the mechanics of visas. It was the feeling the mechanics produced. Because for millions of people, border control is not a distant policy debate. It is a lived ritual, one that quietly trains the nervous system to expect humiliation. You do not simply apply, you assemble your life into evidence. Bank statements, employment letters, invitations, proof of property, proof of ties, proof of return, proof. You pay fees that can swallow months of income. You travel to a capital city because there is no embassy near your home. You queue. You wait. Then, you stand behind glass, watched by someone who has the power to compress your future into a few questions and a stamp. And the stamp does not arrive with explanation. It arrives with silence. That is why, when Washington expanded travel restrictions in mid-December 2025, many across Africa did not experience it as a sudden shock. They experienced it as confirmation. Not that the door had closed, but that it had always been conditional, and the conditions were never equally distributed. Yet for audiences accustomed to moving through the world without needing permission, the same policy reads differently. In the United States, the proclamation was framed through the familiar language of national security, screening, vetting, information sharing, public safety, bureaucratic nouns that sound neutral until you realize what they do in practice. The Federal Register version of the proclamation situates the action in this tradition of protecting the security of the United States, a framing that places the burden of risk on national origin long before any individual action is considered. Then came the reversal. On the 31st of December, 2025, reports broke that Mali and Burkina Faso would ban United States citizens from entering explicitly as a reciprocal response to Washington's restrictions. The words used by their foreign ministries mattered. Not rage, not pleading, not negotiation reciprocity. Here is the line that turns the key in the lock. Mali's foreign ministry phrased it in a way that is almost mathematically cold, an administrative mirror. It would apply the same conditions and requirements to United States nationals as those imposed on Malian citizens. That sentence is the crescendo because it reveals the real battle is not over flights or tourist revenue. It is over status, over who is allowed to impose conditions without being questioned and who is expected to absorb conditions as if they were the weather. International coverage immediately framed the move as tit for tat, retaliatory, reciprocal. The point was not that large numbers of Americans would be affected by most accounts. Few Americans travel to either country compared to major tourist destinations. The point was the psychological jolt. The American passport, used to being waved through the world as if it carried an invisible stamp of belonging, was suddenly placed into the same category system that so many others have lived under for decades. And in West Africa, the reaction described in multiple reports was not panic, it was recognition. Mali and Burkina Faso are governed by military juntas, and both have distanced themselves from the regional bloc ECOWAS in recent years. That political context helps explain why their response read less like diplomacy and more like command logic. When you are treated as a subordinate in a hierarchy, you do not beg for a softer leash, you cut the rope, or you knot it back around the other side. Washington's stated rationale also fed the emotional fire. Coverage noted that the United States cited instability, armed groups, and violence in the region, language that may sound like prudence in one ear, but in another ear can feel like a single brush dragged across vastly different lives, cultures, and intentions. So the crescendo became a collision of two truths. One truth is institutional. States have the legal power to restrict entry, and the United States justified its policy as security-focused governance. The other truth is human. When policies treat nationality as suspicion, they reshape dignity. They teach people what the world thinks of them without ever saying their names. This is why the story caught fire online and in newsrooms. Because it made the hierarchy legible. It showed that the global mobility system is not simply how the world works. It is an arrangement that can be copied, mirrored, and crucially reversed. And once reversal becomes imaginable, something changes inside the audience. Not at the border, not in an embassy queue, not on a runway, in the mind. Because the most powerful form of power is the kind you do not notice. It is the kind that feels like nature. The moment you notice it, the spell weakens. The moment you feel what it is like to be classified purely by a passport, purely by birthplace, the architecture stops looking neutral and starts looking designed. And design invites revision. If a simple principle, reciprocity, can expose the hidden ranking of the world in a single week, what happens when an entire generation stops asking for access and starts building alternatives that do not require permission at all? Here is the uncomfortable truth. In strictly material terms, this reciprocity may change almost nothing for most people's daily routines. There are not crowds of American holidaymakers pouring into Bamako or Ouagadougou. There is no vast tourism industry that lives or dies on United States arrivals. There is no sudden collapse in trade routes visible from space. On paper, it can look like a symbolic gesture with limited practical cost. And yet, this is exactly why it matters. Because symbolism is not decoration. Symbolism is how political legitimacy is minted. especially in states where legitimacy is contested and constantly tested. Both Mali and Burkina Faso are currently governed by military juntas, and international reporting framed their response explicitly as reciprocal, an answer to Washington's expanded restrictions rather than an unrelated domestic policy shift. In other words, the consequence is not primarily economic. It is psychological. It is civic. It is about status. When the United States framed its restrictions as protection, security, vetting, public safety, it spoke in the language that makes exclusions sound neutral and technical. But when Mali and Burkina Faso replied with reciprocity, they translated those technical nouns into a social reality that ordinary people already recognize. The world is not only organized by laws, but by hierarchies. And hierarchies are felt in the body long before they are debated in Parliament. That is why this episode ripples through civilian life. Even if no one's flight itinerary changes, it reshapes what young people believe is possible and what they believe is worth chasing. For decades, the psychological center of gravity in many post-colonial societies was a promise that the ultimate horizon of opportunity lay elsewhere, that if you could get the right visa, the right scholarship, the right passport stamp, your story could begin again on the other side of the world. But what happens when that promise is repeatedly delayed, then quietly denied, then turned into policy effective on a date, printed in an official register, justified by a category rather than a person? You do not only lose access, you lose faith in the fairness of the gate. And when faith collapses, something changes that politicians rarely measure. Ambition stops orbiting the gate. That shift has two immediate consequences for civilians. First, it can harden pride into a kind of defensive dignity, an emotional refusal to keep auditioning for entry. The appeal of reciprocity is not that it blocks someone else. It is that it names the imbalance without begging. Reports on the announcements emphasize the principle of reciprocity as the stated justification. For many ordinary people, that feels like closure, not isolation closure. A line drawn to protect the psyche from constant judgment. Second, it can reorder the definition of success. When the border stops looking aspirational and starts looking arbitrary, the dream begins to migrate. Not necessarily to another continent, but to another strategy. People start asking quieter, more practical questions. What can be built here? What markets can be reached without humiliating cues? What partnerships can be formed without permission slips? This is where politics enters the scene. Mali and Burkina Faso have been moving through a turbulent regional moment, including tension and distancing from the West African bloc ECOWAS as part of broader political ruptures in the Sahel. In that environment, symbolism is not optional. It is a language of survival. A military-led government does not only promise safety, it must also project strength and independence. Reciprocity provides a clean, legible demonstration of that posture. We will not be sorted quietly. And that is where the civic consequence becomes sharper and more complicated. Because civic pride can be a seed, but it can also become a shield. Pride can motivate reform, but it can also excuse failure. If the public is offered dignity through symbolic victories while daily insecurity, unemployment, and rising prices remain, the story can split in two. One narrative for the nation's honor, another for the nation's hardships. This is the pivot point, where a single name begins to matter not as mythology, but as responsibility. If leaders invoke sovereignty, people will eventually ask what sovereignty delivers beyond headlines. If a government speaks the language of self-determination, citizens will ask whether that determination translates into safer roads, functioning schools, and work that keeps young talent rooted in its own soil. This is where Ibrahim Traoré enters the wider imagination of the moment, not as a slogan, but as a symbol onto which expectations of dignity and delivery are projected. So here is the question for you, and I want you to answer it in the comments with brutal honesty. If reciprocity makes people feel proud, but changes little in their material lives, Is it still progress? Or is it simply a powerful performance? Because whichever way you answer, it reveals what this episode truly set in motion. It is not just a diplomatic exchange. It is a renegotiation of what people are willing to tolerate, what they are willing to internalize, and what they are willing to build without permission. And once a population stops internalizing a hierarchy, the hierarchy starts to wobble. The next battleground is not the embassy queue. It is the international stage, where allies, blocs, and global powers will decide whether this was a brief flare-up or the first visible crack in a system built to keep some passports above the rest. Zoom out, and you can see why this story traveled so fast. It did not behave like a normal diplomatic dispute. In a typical standoff, you get the choreography statements, condemnations, back-channel calls, carefully worded concern. Here, the most striking thing was the clean geometry of it. The United States expanded entry restrictions in mid-December 2025, framing the move as a national security measure tied to screening, vetting, and public safety. And within days, the Sahelian response was presented as reciprocity, not an argument, but a mirror. International coverage latched onto that symmetry because it exposes a hidden rule of the global order. Travel policy is never only about travel. It is also a signal of rank. When a powerful state restricts movement, the action is often treated as policy. When a smaller state responds in kind, it becomes provocation. That double standard is precisely what reciprocity disrupts. It forces the world to admit out loud that the passport system is not merely administration. It is hierarchy, disguised as procedure. And this time, the hierarchy had context. Multiple reports noted that Mali and its neighbor, Burkina Faso, are governed by military juntas, and that both have distanced themselves from the regional bloc ECOWAS in recent years. That matters, because it shapes incentives. A civilian government may prioritize reputation management, soften the blow, negotiate exemptions, protect optics. A military-led government often prioritizes perceived strength and internal legitimacy. Prove that you will not absorb, downgrade, in silence. From Washington's side, the rationale was also framed in broad, structural terms. The expanded restrictions were justified publicly, with references to instability, violence, and the presence of armed groups in the region, alongside claims about deficient information needed for screening and vetting. That framing is powerful because it shifts the burden. The individual is no longer assessed first. The category comes first. In other words, the person arrives already pre-labeled by origin. And here is where the international lens becomes sharper. Once categories become the unit of judgment, reciprocity becomes easier to defend. If a state says, "We are being treated as a risk class," then answering with equivalent conditions can be presented coldly as sovereign equality rather than rage. Even critics who dislike the move are forced to debate the principle, not merely the emotion. But the deeper international consequence is not legal. It is psychological. Global power depends on being desired, not just feared, desired. And the West's mobility advantage has long worked like gravity. It pulls talent, dreams, and deference towards its gates. The most destabilizing possibility raised by this episode is not that the bans persist. It is that millions of people stop emotionally believing the gate is the center of the world. Because once belief breaks, the system does not collapse overnight. It simply loses its spell. And when power loses its invisibility, it has to rely on enforcement, an expensive substitute for legitimacy. So the next chapter is bigger than visas. If reciprocity can make the hierarchy visible in a single news cycle, what happens when countries start redesigning the map of partnerships, trade routes, regional blocs, and security alliances without waiting for approval from the old gatekeepers? There is a temptation to treat this entire episode as a brief flare-up, an exchange of restrictions that will quietly soften once the headlines move on. But that temptation misunderstands what actually shifted. The most important change was not written into a visa form. It was written into perception. Once people see a hierarchy as something that can be mirrored, the hierarchy no longer feels like fate. It feels like design. And when something feels designed, it can be redesigned. So what comes next? In the short term, the risks are real. Reciprocity can harden into a cycle. A policy mirror can become a policy maze. More paperwork, more uncertainty, more friction for ordinary travelers caught between governments. It can also narrow diplomatic space, making cooperation in areas like security, humanitarian access, and professional exchange more complicated than it needs to be. And in the Sahel, complication is not a luxury. The region faces armed violence, displacement, and deep economic pressure problems that cannot be solved through symbolism alone. This is the danger line. When a government uses sovereignty as a shield, it may be tempted to offer pride as a substitute for delivery. But there is another path, one that turns dignity into construction rather than posture. If the old model was dependence, the new model must be capability. If the old story was, we need access, the new story becomes, we will build options. That is where the phrase trade over aid stops being a slogan and becomes an agenda, processing and value addition instead of exporting raw materials, regional supply chains instead of single-gate reliance, digital work that crosses borders without asking for a stamp, and partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than permission. The future will not be decided by who gets invited into the old room. It will be decided by who builds new rooms. This is where the Sahel's next choices matter, because reciprocity is only the first step. A mirror can expose inequality, but it cannot feed families. A ban can make a point, but it cannot create jobs. A symbolic victory can raise the chest, but it cannot lower the price of bread. So the road ahead is a test of seriousness. Will leaders translate the language of dignity into reforms that touch daily life? Security that protects civilians, education that prepares young talent, and economic strategy that keeps value inside the country rather than shipping it out? Will the rhetoric of sovereignty become policies that strengthen institutions, not just speeches that strengthen pride? And if that translation happens, if the seed becomes a harvest, then the psychological shift we have been describing could become something much larger. A generation that measures success not by leaving, but by building, not by being accepted, but by being capable, not by chasing the light elsewhere, but by lighting its own road. This is why the story matters, even if the visas change tomorrow, because the bigger question remains. If people stop treating Western gates as the center of the world, what happens to global power when it is no longer the object of desire, but merely one option among many? And that brings us to the final, unavoidable moment. Because once a hierarchy loses its spell, the real battle begins. Not over borders, but over belief itself. In the end, this was never simply a story about who can fly, where. It was a story about the invisible architecture of the modern world. An architecture built not only from laws and airports, but from assumptions. Assumptions about who belongs, who is trusted, who is questioned, and who must constantly prove they are not a risk. For decades, that architecture has operated like gravity. Some passports move first and explain later. Others explain first and still get turned away. And because the system was familiar, it felt natural, until reciprocity held up a mirror and made the design visible. The United States framed its restrictions as security. Mali and Burkina Faso framed their response as reciprocity. The practical impact may be limited. The psychological impact is not. Because once people recognize a hierarchy as something that can be copied, flipped, and challenged, they stop treating it as destiny. They stop internalizing its judgment. They begin to detach, not with angry slogans, but with something far more disruptive: indifference. And indifference changes everything. It is easy to dismiss symbolism, but symbolism is where the future begins. Pride can be a spark, yet it must become construction. A nation cannot live on reflection alone. It must plant, build, harvest. That is the real test of sovereignty, whether it reaches the soil of daily life. This is where Ibrahim Traoré returns to the center of the question, not as a name to chant, but as a responsibility to carry. Because when leaders speak in the language of dignity, people will eventually demand dignity in outcomes: safer streets, stronger institutions, work that keeps young talent rooted at home, and partnerships that look like trade rather than dependence. Ibrahim Traoré cannot be merely a symbol. Ibrahim Traoré must be measured by what changes after the speeches end. And what about Burkina Faso? Burkina Faso sits at the heart of this moment precisely because it forces the world to confront a basic principle. Equality is not a favor. It is a standard. If a rule can be applied to one side without explanation, it can be questioned and mirrored by the other. So here is the final question I want to leave with you. If millions of people stop believing Western gates are the center of the world, what happens to global power when it is no longer desired? If this story made you think differently, do not watch in silence. Share your view in the comments. And if you want more stories that follow dignity, sovereignty, and the road ahead, subscribe and stay with us. The next chapter is already being written by those who have decided they will no longer ask for permission to have a future.